So to begin with, we need to acknowledge that we live in the sort of world where clearly there is an antithetical relationship between events in the world with one another, agencies in the world with one another, and as well as types of experience with one another. And these are related in an antithetical way, which I call antivalence. So in order to represent antivalence simply, I'll just go ahead and represent it as a straight line of this form. And this is the condition of antivalence in which we sadly currently exist. So it would look like that, and if A and B were antivalent, they would be in this condition here as per the operation symbolized thus. A and B standing for any event, experience, entity, or agency or mind involved in an ambivalent relationship. They may not be completely ambivalent with one another, but they may be ambivalent by degrees, which means that different proportions of their actual relationship may be ambivalent. So, in the case where the important forces, in this case, characteristics should be added to the list of the world, are in ambivalent opposition, I address the matter of ethics in their terms as good and evil. So I just use the classical words that describe those phenomena, those characteristics of the world, which are further characteristics of the agencies, the minds, the events, the entities, the consequences, all the things in the world which are praised and blamed, everything which is enjoyed and hated, everything which is sought and feared, and a good deal more could be said to enumerate this basic distinction, but it is basically ambivalence. And ambivalence is exactly that relationship which establishes the zero-sum interaction between elements of any kind A and B, so that if one is increased, the other is decreased necessarily. If one is said to thrive, the other is said to be deprived. It must be that way. Now, in the world in which we exist, there is ambivalence, but it was before, as I stated and explained thoroughly in my previous videos on metaphysics, which are in my older videos. And I would recommend anyone that's interested in the metaphysical groundwork laid out generally, as I say there also, for all that I say in these more recent videos, to go back to those old videos that I made within the last 2 years and look at what I have to say there, especially about the metaphysics. So I call it the Gnostic Metaphysics series, and then there's a lot else to look at too besides that, which will help explain, for example, what I mean by ambivalence for those not familiar already. But in the case of relations of ambivalence, there is a zero-sum relation, so that in fact the creation of one is the destruction of the other, and vice versa. When it comes to the results of this in the world, when they actually interact, you'll see that there is one side which operates in one way, and the other side operates in a different way, which complements it only in the strict logical sense of being the other side of that equation. And just for the sake of setting up a standard pattern, we're going to just pick one side and call it the original reality, when ambivalence was in its potential form. So that would be, in this case, A, we'll say. And we'll make the other one, therefore, the potential ambivalent to A, which was not in existence yet, and then was not in existence yet. Then there would therefore be this condition of the universe, which we'll put as a P for potentiality. And in that world, at some point, there came to be an occasion in which, for some reason, B was actualized. That is a very dark mystery, and we'll just leave it at that for now. But that's going into the fundamental metaphysics to work with that. So we'll just avoid that for now. Just state generally that there was a point when that was actualized, and when it was actualized, because of being so antithetical in just the way that Antivalence describes, duality was created in a way that had never existed before, and in a way that's abusive of all those prior existing dualities. Duality itself is not evil. That's another example of where the New Age really shows their very superficial understanding of anything they talk about, at best. And then it really shows just how clearly demonstrable it is, the category of their thought, that the category of their thought is in fact ambivalent to mine. The category of my thought, which pertains to absolute distinctions of good and evil, is something they absolutely will not entertain. With their mouth parts, with their vocal cords, with their linguistic apparatus that's contained in their skull, which I don't even know if I want to call it brain. It's just like a broken record. There is no real evil. There is no real good. It's all relative, and maybe everything's good. Evil's just a way to help us learn and grow. We'll not get into that right now because it could just turn into a rant, I'm sure, because just functionally speaking, these people are consistently in opposition to the notion that there is any such thing as a fundamental opposition between any things that we describe as good and evil. And as I said before, good and evil are not just empty terms. They mean all the things arrayed in our language on one side as desirable and on the other as undesirable, basically. We don't have to resort to mysticism to understand just how antithetical those things are. Now, wherever people can be confused about them and wherever they can be parsed in relative terms is one thing, but the fundamental absolute distinction between them is inviolate, or else those relativities could never be conceived. It doesn't work the other way around. That I also explained in my earlier metaphysical videos. Videos on metaphysics. So this world comes to exist basically at the beginning in this manner, which I would say is that would be the intermediate actually. So let's make that standard. This is actually where we are right now, so I use this one. Actually, and in that realm, this comes to occur, which is the beginning, and I'll thoroughly explain why that shape is used. And when this occurs, one side is found to have a certain distinction from the other that we'll call the difference between A and B, so that the new that is now actual it thrives in the destruction of the former soul manifest type of reality. It's a different kind of being fundamentally. Because when we think of being, as Parmenides rightly said, we don't speak of something that destroys itself. That makes no sense. And we don't think of something that creates itself. But we think of something too fundamentally real to be either created or destroyed. In the case of this kind of being, those properties are all negated in order for these types of being to thrive. And that's why we call these, and therefore these exist by committing acts undesirable and damaging, detrimental to the original type of being. And all of the forms of evil activity in the world which force us to come up with a word for it, and all of the kind of implications, all the kinds of implications that they bring about toward the detriment of anyone, even one another. There's no honor among thieves. Force us to understand this relationship to be purely antithetical in essence. But in cases where a specific entity is not completely one or the other, then there can be some sort of homeostasis between, say, a parasite and its victim or host, populations of predator and prey, that will make it seem as though there is a communion between the two, but there's no community between the two except through a special form of corruption, which is very destructive to one and beneficial only to the other. So, in other words, the only way they can relate is where one is destroyed at the other's for the other's benefit. But the initial existing type of being was self-sufficient relative to its newborn aggressor. This newborn aggressor has some element alien to the original reality and is destructive of it in order to exist. It never exists without that feature. Therefore, we could never say, what we can say of both is that for one to exist properly, it requires the destruction of the other. For example, in this condition, the original reality existed without the actual presence of the falsified form, which is shown here to be only potential. So it wasn't actually manifest. This glass of water is not actually dropped by me. It will not actually shatter on the floor. It's potential. It's a potential, but it's not actually happening. We'll actually take a sip of it. That actually happened. It didn't have to, but it did. It wasn't necessarily going to happen, but it did. It was a possibility until it did. So potentiality is meant to be the more causal sense, whereas of the term of an essential idea that for which, in the logical sense, possibility is the more useful term. In this relationship, therefore, it is clear that in all senses proper to the term destruction and self-sufficient, though the original form of reality of self-sufficient and this arbitrary, we shall say, spurious form of reality is destructive by nature. If this were not the case, this notion would never have been devised to help us articulate the problem. Evil would never have been a word, as it would never have been a thing. Unicorns are a thing because they make some kind of sense in the mind. But how can, what horses make sense, horns make sense, horses with horns make sense, horses have hooves. Horns are basically made of a similar type of biological or extruded. They're an extrusion of biological processes like hair, hooves, which in fact all have something in common in that they are extrusions of a fundamental biological process that are functional. Those are functional. Hair is functional. A horn will be functional, and it is functional in most animals which have them, for sure. At least in that case, we could know that the question of a unicorn is sensible enough because all of its component aspects make sense. So just putting them together makes conceivable sense. The only question is, do such things exist? If you saw one, if you saw one that actually existed and looked just like a unicorn that you imagined, you're in a possible world where they always did exist the way you imagined, and then you run into one. At first sight, you're experiencing what you might take to be a hallucination at first. It's such an accurate representation of what you imagined it would be right in front of your eyes. Then you come to find out it really is a unicorn, and then you know how unicorns are really constituted biologically, and then you find out what your imagination could only represent to you as an image before. Is there any conceivable way to talk about something so fundamental in that manner, so that it can have no evidence for its existence, and people just spuriously come up with it, and then rearrange their world with it, and invoke it as a resource for authorizing actions of such questionable ethics as massacring people, raping them, pillaging them, using psychotronic weapons against them, spying on them, assassinating them, poisoning them en masse, lying to them en masse, mocking them and insulting them en masse. Just look at the Super Bowl itself as a tradition, and then look at the halftime show that I've just heard secondhand reports about. For people to begin to pretend that this was made up out of thin air is absurd. It was not made up out of thin air. The ambivalence we experience in the world is tangible. It's tangible as any of the parts of a unicorn, and then some. They're far more fundamental, because we're talking about the way the world is across all strata of its phenomena. All of them. I demonstrate that in the metaphysics. So in the case where we are stuck with ambivalence as a reality, we have to explain and understand. We have to get to the root of the question of how it is to be articulated, given that as a fundamental feature of it. The one side which is destructive gains from by its fundamental nature, gains through equivocation. It gains through equivocation, which is fundamentally a form of fallacy in logic, where someone is thinking of a word like, we'll take the word sense. Well, the word sense has two senses. One of them is the one I just used. In that sense, we mean one thing by sense, one meaning. In another case, and that would be, say, meaning one, and the other one would be meaning two, which is that faculty of the mind that perceives the world through, well, what seem to be bodily forms of communication with it. Both of those meanings, both of those senses, are experienced with the same linguistic term, which is the term sense, as a sound. And really, in fact, that should be to try to create some added dimension of exposition and to keep it consistent in that form. I'm going to here refer to the phenomenological contents of consciousness, which are, as they say, subjective, but most accurately we could say involve qualia. By using the color blue, or I will try to at least. So the sound that you hear and the word that you see when I say sense is one. There's one form with all its permutations, but it contains both senses of itself, which I just do that. I sure did. Yes, you're going to be blue because you're a meaning one, meaning two, sense, whereas the morpheme is that noise, that image. But the two senses are tangibly a content different than the form, either of which are associated with it somewhat arbitrarily. Now, the point is that, given that there are two senses of the word sense, I wouldn't want to confuse them because that would be ridiculous. If you were to ask me in what sense I mean the term sense, I wouldn't want to say I mean in sight, or I mean in hearing, or I mean it doesn't make any sense. There's no pun there. It doesn't make any sense. Well, there is actually. It does. Well, it only makes. How does it make a sense? You don't make a sense with that. Therefore, that's irrational. That sense has to be refuted because it's self-contradictory. The sense that it makes is the sense we mean in meaning one, and I choose to make it meaning one, which is the sense of, because I want it on top and I don't want it on one too this way. And that is the content of in the mind, in which by which meaning is ascribed to something, so as to promote one interpretation rather than another. It's not necessarily exclusive with other senses. Some senses can overlap, they're isomorphic. The second sense is the one which makes no sense if you ask, in what sense do I mean sense? If you ask me, in what sense do I mean sense? I can't say, I mean in sight, or I mean in hearing, or I mean in taste. That would not make sense logically. It would make sense only if that could somehow create sense. But there's no sense that can create. One, the senses are not created, the faculties of perception are not created, and there's no meaningful way for that to be understood as making sense in the sense we mean it here. Therefore, if you ask me in what sense do I say sense, you can only with that question mean this. So the context of the sentence tells me what sense you mean sense in the sentence. In what sense do you mean sense? Oh, if this is difficult to follow, it's only because I'm using one word repeatedly. There's only one word for both of these terms, for both of these meanings of this term. These should be separate terms, technically, because in one sentence this is the meaning, and another this is the meaning, though the morpheme is the same. Well, that's easily arranged. We could just use another one that's synonymous with sense. Technically, sense is probably more fundamentally meaning to in this list, which has to do with the faculties of perception. Therefore, I will use sense for meaning to in this context, just to keep it from. But if you rewind it and listen to it again, it will make sense as you go along. But you'll have to probably do it numerous times. It's really not the wording that's the problem. It's the semantics of the wording, which are richer than they would at first seem. You would think metaphysics is richer than the surfaces of phenomena that it analyzes. Perfect parallel with that. And with the other, we'll use the term. Say, interpretation, because that's almost undeniably a subjective feature of experience involving perceptions. For example, I perceive the word sense, and I interpret in that when you say the sentence, in what sense do you mean sense? I know you don't mean this sense, so I know you mean the other. I can tell by the context that's the one you mean. So I think in my mind, basically, the equivalent of how do you interpret sense? And I dare say it looks like more than a fruitful serendipity that I chose interpretation, because if someone were to ask me the same question, what sense do you mean sense, using interpretation for one of the words sense, in that sentence they would say, in what way do you interpret sense? Technically, if you put it in quotation marks and say it, they mean in what way do I interpret the word? In what way what way am I using or meaning the word sense? You could ask me that all through this conversation, right? But if the interpretation of sense is understood more generally, it becomes metaphysical, because, in fact, the relationship of interpretation, or the cognitive sense of the word sense, and the perceptual faculty of sensation, under which we generally describe as the senses, there's a relation where, in fact, this functionally relates to that in its own term, in that an interpretation of a sense is whereby we have the interpretation, the sense of the word sense that is the meaning of interpretation, leaving out the way digital machines interpret code. That's really by analogy. But the sense of an interpretation, likewise carries back the meaning, in that, well, you can have it in both ways. You can have the sense in which we interpret the meaning of something, because this is functionally an interpolated idea. Sense was the more fundamental in its use. Perception was the primary. People really do believe, mistakenly, that that's the primary aspect of experience in the sense of physical sensation, but it's actually not. But in that sense, we could say, what is the sense of the interpretation? Well, we could mean what sensory faculty was used, or through which an interpretation occurred, or we could mean in what variety of an interpretation was a sense interpreted, in what variety. So the relationship between those two terms, which grows directly out of the term we started with, sense, automatically of its own, with the proper interpretation, it evolves automatically of its own into a set of tight relationships of implication and also causation, which is profoundly reinforcing of the basic sense of the term, likewise, of its synonymous term here, interpretation, in that it's not only a handy term for giving us the other sense of sense. And we started with this as term one, and it encompassed both meaning one and meaning two. And we brought this in to distinguish meaning one from meaning two by using a different word, interpretation. But it's not just a good stand-in to make another term for meaning one, but it happens when in relation to the second term, provides the fundamental relationship between the two meanings. At least it's definitely working out that way. Given that that's the case, and we have an understanding of the way terms are used and how complicated it can be, although it can be settled into a kind of cognitive homeostasis, which can be generalized into a schema and into which we can apply many examples. The fundamental question of the relation between the parasitic form of being and the victim it would feed upon requires an understanding of how this can go wrong fundamentally. And when the interpretation, let us just say that when the signal and its interpretation, or what it signifies, which is on the other end, so you have the signal in the middle, which is somewhat objective, right? And then you have the sort of sense of what that means about what signaled. If something signaled that signal, it doesn't come from nowhere. It is the extrusion of the intention of another mind. I'm using the Berkeleyan sense of other minds there. The interpretation that I make of it being a subjective feature, I'm using S as subjective in that sense, ties in with the source of the signal, which is an objective feature, which is also another mind which is subjective and bears an intent. Again, the forces of nature which we don't think possess mentality, and about that very notion we may be mistaken, definitely do extrude effects which then reach us as signals in our mind about what's going on around us through our sense faculties. Now, if we can interpret that correctly, then we'll get a relation. And by the way, this is definitely not a subliminal way of saying I need help, but SOS. But in a sense, every of this type of being in the world should probably be spending more of their time sending out that signal to the form of reality which has any power over this, wherever they can and in any way that they can, not just on their own behalf, but on the behalf of others. And so in that sense, this is a sort of serendipitous manifestation of the way events can concatenate in order to open up realms of interpretation that are significant for our endeavor. That's very serendipitous. Ironically, we live in a world where serendipity is just about dead. I tell you, someone who is truly confused about the world around them sees serendipity where there really isn't any. In cases where someone just faked spontaneity or faked genuineness, basically lied to them, took advantage of them, and con artists do it all the time. That is exactly what their crime is. to gain someone's confidence and then abuse that trust by taking advantage of them in some way. Well, that means that we can already see that the distinction between the sense of some signal and its interpretation concerning the source of that signal can be deviant from each other, in that what is thought to be the source, you could say, is this one up here, is the thought to be source, is inaccurate, and the actual source is down here. Where this is not the case, that the sense of the signal is meet with the interpretation, and both with the actual source of the signal, in this case maybe a sense experience. This whole thing is a sense experience in a certain sense. We got to adjust once again. Where that's not the case, where that's not correct, in fact, this sense would carry a characteristic akin to an ambivalent relationship to the other, so that in fact we could literally just state some way that, well, we'll call this 1, and we'll call this 2. And this one we'll call, well, we'll just put this in parentheses. And so if it's not in parentheses, we're not assigning a 1 or a 2 to it. It's not going to be in this formula here. But basically, what we can show from that is that, therefore, well, let's just go back to the physical, to the concrete. S1 and S2 are ambivalent. So, in this way, right now, generally. That is revealed by this relation here. Being that's always true. And the question that the subject of the experience always wants to know, the mind that's having the experience, invested in the experience, is whether or not they're really getting this. If in a situation where that's claimed by any agent, they want to know if that agent is telling the truth. In other words, what they tell is true to what is the case, and that true to what the recipient of the telling is led to believe. Well, of course, they're being led to believe is insisted there, because not just whatever they happen to believe, which could be because they're confused or deluded in some way, but what they're led to believe. And if that is true with what they're told, and both of those are true with what is the case, then we have this form of cognitive and every other form of experience, social, political, every kind of experience there can be, where it is actually deviant from that in this ambivalent way. You have every form of falsehood, deception, fraud, confusion, illusion, hallucination, delusion. Well, I certainly can't be deluded about this. If I'm deluded about this, I could make a machine that would operate on this logic. You couldn't make a machine that would operate on a logic that was the opposite of this. So I can't be wrong about it. It doesn't matter if some average psychologist or psychiatrist or some other dope would look at this and go, well, guys, go, whatever. It's like, really? So that means it's all scribbles when you don't understand it, right? It's all, this logic is in itself consistent, and its contrary is in itself inconsistent. There's no way that this could be taken in a sense where that's not true. Given the fundamental nature of ambivalence, given that the nature of experience, as we have it in the human form, wherever ambivalence is possible, reveals one side to be the instigator of the ambivalence and the other to be the intended target of it, we would say that one side of the matter is always actuated, potentially, by the force we've designated as B here, but which means the evil mind, archaically. And that fundamental distinction is found to have at its nexus the situations involving the objective features of experience. And the relationship between the objective features of experience of one mind and those of another mind are part and parcel of the total sum of their relationships, though it may not be exhaustive of them. And certainly, in its normalized and its preponderant forms, may yet just be a habitual and truncated expression of their actual relationships, which may in fact be broader and or more specialized or more impactful or more significant than implied by the manifestly known and manifestly expressed relationships that they hold. There may be more senses to their relationship than the written or spoken words of their relationships of any kind, contractual, any form of communication that they may obtain with one another. It just may be deeper, broader, more significant, and more varied, more specialized, more intense, more significant than any of those manifested expressions of their relationship. And that's also true in that in the sense that we can also see that if this were, we would say, probably the formal objectivity and the contentual subjectivity, this bears a relationship which fundamentally maps over into the notion that the crucial interaction between the beings being centered around objective features of each one's experiences, they overlap and relate various ways, is amenable in worlds where ambivalence has been actualized to permutations of a deeper and broader and more significant reality, which underlies the actual relationship B is construing with A, and that A is being misled into accepting with B, which binds them into a relationship that claims to be one but is in fact another, and that those are ambivalent. And therefore that the fundamental crux of the problem is that manifesting between, because what enabled this, manifesting between the formerly potential and now actual evil form of being was a corruption in the let's just say the status quo of the way beings interact and communicate, involving objective features of their experience that could be interpreted as, say, material, bodily, formal in some senses. And those corruptions opened up the way, enabled the portal through which came evil effects, which demonstrated evil-mindedness, and then we had to sort out the question of the origin of the evil mind and what's to be done about it on all levels of reality, not just on this level where we're having the discussion. And given this fundamental condition in which evil is enabled by this crux of experiential relations between and among different beings and forces of being and so forth. We often say in Gnostic paradigmatics that it is matter itself that is evil, because were it not for this being susceptible to this kind of fraud, defrauding of its substantial propriety as a part of experience. In other words, able to be brought into question, able to be defiled. If it were not for that part of the human experience or any experience, evil would never have purchase in the world. So, while that's an important step to take in understanding the nature of evil, it doesn't claim right offhand, nor do I say that it does, to exhaust the meaning of the term, just in that there must be an agent beyond the circumstances of deceptive appearances, capable of turning that to an evil advantage in order for that to manifest an evil consequence for the victim. That agency cannot be reduced to the scope of this aspect of experience, because it is not, strictly speaking, agental. It is a nexus of agencies. That's purely relative. Objectivity is purely relative, not subjectivity. That's absolute. It's found that the quality is destructive of the other and therefore could not have originated it. Therefore, we say, quite logically, and in many senses demonstrably so, that the essence of evil is simply not compatible with an origin in what we now in this universe are forced to call good. It was never something to be discussed or argued about or even exclaimed about in joy in the original reality. It was the norm. And it's still treated linguistically as the norm. Health is good. Health is the norm. Disease is bad. Disease and dysfunction are not the norm. They're deviations from the norm, which would be called dysfunctional and dysmorphic, or basically dysfunctional would be sufficient for it. Function is the primary version, and dysfunction embraces all perversions of it, which are improper. Perversion in its fundamental sense may in fact not require us to say debased, but may simply enable us to say varied, different, and so in the case where in the original reality there were many varieties of what is originally real and how it engages in experience with itself. But there's only one fundamental way to oppose all that, and that is to cause the effects which are called evil, which we know very well in our world. I'm not going to lecture on. I don't want to say it. Okay, I don't want to say it. But let's just say that the words infant and inappropriate conduct, those words should never be in the same sentence. And that happens a lot in this world. So, something to be sad about, if you want to find something to be sad about. But instead, a lot of people just carry on looking the other way. So, in order to account for why they do that, I've been forced to thoroughly consider the matter, and in so doing, I've attracted the attention of said occult groups, people who do those things, into detail about which I will not go right now. And they forced the issue so that I've had to rejoin their attack with a proper defense that explains what they've been up to and why those who claim certain wrong things about me are wrong, and I can demonstrate that. And I will continue to do so, not only on my behalf and for my sake, but on behalf of and for the sake of all those who are currently in this world victims of evil abuses involving falsifications of authority, falsifications of value, including the deceptions involved in the creation of and subsequent abuse of the trust held by children to their parents, citizens to their governmental officials, people who were supposedly partners in business or any other type of association with their supposedly fellow beings. Whenever that's completely detrimentally attacked by the evidence of your senses, now I'm using that term, by the evidence of your senses that are empirically, by the quality of their content, inescapably just horrible and unacceptable, undesirable, disgusting, repugnant. And when there is no way to interpret that removes culpability from an agent, cannot be accident, cannot be chance. And when we cannot decide by any means that make any sense that the agency could be the being itself to itself in kind or in instance, God doesn't commit suicide by becoming evil or enabling evil, nor would attempt to, nor as a whole, nor among any of God's parts participating familially generated emanations of God's self. They would never do that. But something did. And that extrudes into the world toward us as those aspects of its objective features, other people, often is the form, as Sartre rightly said, they are the harbingers of hell. So as to create the conditions that we call evil in the first place. There would be no way for any of that to be occurring where they're not an agent, and it cannot be the agents involved in the proper conduct of beings. So that leaves only whatever other agents there are, and who cares what kind and how many or where they're from. Just as long as they can all be forced back there, kept there permanently. If that sucks for them, well then that sucks for them. Because right now, this world, which was instantiated by them, sucks for everybody but them. And even for them too. Only the chief most among them is the primary and safest beneficiary of their entire process of fraudulent abuse, of enslavement and menticide of other beings. Enslavement of and menticide against other beings. So for certain, that's not our problem. We just want them to go back into whatever that is, and that to be kept permanently the case. The process of doing that is going to be as painful for them as all that led up to its manifesting before being reversed. Everything they did will be rejected, shunted back onto them, and restored will be all the beings who suffered under that regime of abuse, because the energy will be transmuted back to its origin. That is why I say that is the case, because it's the only way that it could be the case based on everything we know, and it's the exact reversal of what happened so that it is the case. The reversal of the effect back to its cause. So that's why I say to each his own. Because in this case, we have the opposite of to each his own. This was the beginning of You can have yours, but I can too. And there's things that I can do, but you can't. There's things that you can have, but some of the things that you have, you can't have. That's going to be mine now. And I have the power to do that to you, but you can't do that to me. That's against the law. So in order to understand the kind of evil consciousness that can behave in this manner, and in order to analyze all of its manifestations in language, in culture, and in all forms of human conduct, thought, speech, and action, we have to set up a framework of analysis that enables that. And this is the first of my series of videos in the Gnostic Axiology, which lay that meta-axiological basis of analysis.